Hello and welcome. My name is Danette FM and welcome to this season of Adapt with Danette FM. We're in season 2 and we're talking about collaboration and problem solving. And I'd love to welcome in our producer, Jez FM, who also happens to be my son.
Exactly. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Adapt Season 2, Episode 2. Very exciting. We're going to have a great episode here. But I just wanted to explain a little bit about what the pod is. So the podcast that you're listening to right now is a companion podcast to the amazing book, The Adaptable Leader by Danette Fenton-Menzies, who is Danette FM. And we've done season 1 that was about adaptability. This season, we're focusing on problem solving and collaboration, which is, also to do with adaptability. So I guess today we're going to be talking about military level trust. Now, that phrasing is very specific. So, Danette, did you want to sort of give us any insights you had before we talk about today's guest and conversation?
I loved this conversation. So our guest is Dr. Mike Smith, and he's got a long background where he worked with the Thunderbirds in the US, which are an amazing team of aviators who fly in formation, very tight formation. And he talks a lot about collaboration. And under really high pressure, really, if things go wrong, it is life or death. So I really love the insights that Dr. Mike Smith brought to this conversation. And we call him Doc because he's a good friend.
Yeah, exactly. And he's done a lot of different things. He's worked with John Mattone. He's worked in the U.S. Air Force. He's got a huge history. And actually, if you're watching the video, which you can check out on YouTube or Spotify, check out his background. It's a very beautiful set that he's made for himself there. I think that we may as well jump right into this conversation because it's really good. If you have a notebook and pen, jot down some notes because there's a lot of really good examples throughout this conversation. Did you have any final thoughts, Danette?
No, I think just let's get into the conversation.
Let's do it.
Enjoy, everyone. Hello and welcome, everyone, to the Adapt with Danette FM podcast. And today I've got a special guest coming all the way from the United States. So very excited to introduce Dr. Mike Smith. And Dr. Mike Smith, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you so much, Danette. First of all, I really, really appreciate the invite, and it's so good to see you. So just a brief background on myself. Again, Dr. Mike Smith. I did 26 years in the U.S. Air Force. My last 3 years, I had the honor and privilege of being selected as the first sergeant for the Air Force Thunderbirds. So we got to travel the world doing air shows all over the place. After retiring from the Air Force, again, very fortunate and blessed to be hired as a corporate leader in a Berkshire Hathaway Energy company. So I got to work for Warren Buffett and Greg Abel for about 10 years. Along the way, I got my PhD in industrial organizational psychology, so the study of businesses with the specialization in leadership development and coaching. Up until the end of last year, mid last year, I served as the group CEO for John Mattone Global. And then I recently just started my own thing again, released a best-selling book and off and running, helping everyone discover meaningful change through intentional actions, which is my tagline.
I love that. Love that. And loved your book, by the way. It was awesome. So we're going to start with the questions. And
Yes.
the theme in this season is around collaboration and problem solving. So first question is, what have you seen or experienced that helps you with collaboration and or problem solving?
So I think probably the best example I have of collaboration that leads to the success of a high-performing team was my time on the Thunderbirds. So when you talk about collaboration, one of the things I think there's really two sides of collaboration from my point of view and my experience, right? So the first side of collaboration are leaders being comfortable enough and confident enough in their people, peers, coworkers, subordinates, right, to actually initiate and trust the collaborative process with still some delegation, right? You can still delegate and collaborate at the same time versus just delegating and hands off and you're out of the picture, right? So the first part of collaboration, successful, meaningful collaboration, is the leaders' trust in the people that they surround themselves with and hire. The second piece to successful, meaningful collaboration is everyone within the different teams of the organization knowing their job, right? Inside and out, and really being attached to the two B's, right? Belief and belonging. So when they have those two B's as part of an organization, they know their job, they know what they're supposed to do, then that instills trust in the leader to then delegate through collaboration. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense and a great, great answer. And I love how you brought in the bit about you can still be delegating in this, and because not everyone would think of that. So that's really helpful. All right,
Yes.
let's go to question 2, which is share an example of poor collaboration and or problem solving, and what were the impacts? Now, you don't have to name the organization. It's more just what was the experience and what was the impact?
So, very good question, right? I'm sure a lot of your listeners can probably resonate with this, but so an example of poor collaboration is when I think leaders try to collaborate, right? But don't really do so, right? So it's more of a not even a delegate, right? It's under the guise of collaboration, but then the leader, for whatever reason, right? You've heard the old cliche saying, if you want things right, you might as well do it yourself. Or there's a deadline, like a real tight deadline for it, and there's maybe not as much trust in that moment as there could or should be. So the leader will enlist the help of others, right, to collaborate, but then still end up kind of taking the lead and doing most of the work by themselves and more or less shut out the help that they've invited in, right? So the outcome of that is, again, based on my experiences, the perception then among the collaboratees, if that's even a word, well, it is now, we just invented it. So the perception among those people is, well, I guess he or she just doesn't trust us. They asked us for our help. We're supposed to be doing X, Y, and Z, and we're not. They're just doing it themselves. So there's a perception of a lack of trust. There also could be a perception of the leader doesn't find enough value in us to trust us to do this, right? So then, in the absence of information, right, we can paint a really different picture in our own minds, right? So the perception could be then, well, I guess I'm not valued. Maybe they think I don't know my job as well as I should. So therefore, I don't have the opportunity to grow, to collaborate. So that can cause, right, a rift or a little crack in the team, and whatever fabric was there to begin with could start to come unfrayed. So that was the example of poor collaboration, right? Reach out under the guise of, but still kind of keep it yourself, which then could create the perception of what I just discussed.
Great bad example.
Yeah,
I have to be
great
careful how I say
bad. Yeah, great bad example. I love that.
So let's go to number 3, which was, again, based on your experience, what tips do you have for others, including young people who may be just starting to enter the workplace, around developing their problem solving and or collaboration skills?
Very good question. So I think the first thing I would say around problem solving skills is, number one, learn how to invoke and use critical thinking. So when we talk about critical thinking, right, what we mean is making decisions based on greater criteria, devoid of emotion, right? So logic versus delusion, objective versus subjective, right? And so we're taking emotion out of it. Critical thinking that can really, really amp up problem solving skills. The second thing I would say is to really become an expert at what you're doing, right? Never be afraid to learn, ask for help, grow, evolve, step out, because all those things, the more skilled you become, the more you know, will then enhance and amplify your critical thinking. And then when it comes to collaboration, I would say, especially on the part of maybe someone who is in an informal leadership position or not a leadership position at all, but wants to grow, do not hesitate or be afraid to go to the leaders and ask for the opportunity to collaborate. But when you do that, don't just go and ask the question just to ask the question. Ask the question and then kind of paint the picture of the value that you can bring and why you're so interested in collaborating. Because then that paints a picture for the leader of you have a vested interest, you have a purpose, you really want to contribute, and you want to provide meaningful value. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I love that answer. And I love that you covered both parts as well. This morning I've been studying ethics. And so it's part of being an accountant, and it's something that you need to come back to regularly because the marketplace changes. And I really like that bit about it not being subjective, etc., that you're taking that time to do the critical thinking, because if we don't do that, sometimes we end up going down a slippery slope from an ethical perspective as well.
Yes.
I love that answer.
Yeah,
Awesome.
because I mean, we know that logic is used for decision making and emotion clouds judgment and is used for motivation. So when you try to mix the two, first of all, you really can't, right? But then, like you said, it creates that slippery slope when you're subjective instead of objective.
Love that. Okay, let's go to the next one. What's your favorite example of problem solving collaboration and why?
So I would think, okay, so I'm going back to the Thunderbirds, right? Because again, very high performing team. Everyone wanted to be there, all A-type personalities. Very, very intense screening and hiring application process. So when I think about the collaboration, the outcome, and the why, the problem solving is, first of all, the collaboration among the team, right? When we go to an air show and hit the ground, everyone scatters like cockroaches when you turn the light on because they all know exactly where they're supposed to be, what they're supposed to be doing, how they're supposed to be doing it to get set up for the air show, right? So that's the first thing about collaboration. Everyone trusts each other enough to know that things are going to be in position when they need to be in position. Another example, on the day of the air show, the pilots step out to the jet, get in the cockpit, start the jet up, do a quick check, and they're off. They don't look to make sure there's enough gas. They don't look to make sure the exact coordinates have been programmed in, right? They don't look to make sure there's enough smoke oil in the oil drum because they know that their crew chiefs the night before and the morning of did all that and checked it 2, 3, and 4 times. So the level of trust is there. Also, I don't know if you knew this, but when the Thunderbirds fly the formation, the only pilot that uses their cockpit instruments is number one, the commander leader. All the other pilots look at a spot on his or her plane. Like, so they're flying in the air doing loops and they're looking at they're not looking what's in front of them. They're not looking at the altimeter, not looking at the speed. They trust that when the boss is calling the commands, they do that. So that's the whole collaboration at a higher level. The problem solving skills is, and this is what I love about that, it's the proactive planning for contingencies that might happen when you're out in the field. So as an example, the crowd doesn't know this, but we park spare jets at the end of the taxiway, like, when the Thunderbirds take off and start to go down to prepare to launch and take off. Way down out of the view of the crowd are extra jets. So that if there's a malfunction in one or something isn't right, they don't sit there in front of the crowd and delay the show and try to fix things, right? They just taxi down to the end of the runway. Pilot hops out of that jet into the next jet, back in formation, does the startup and might delay a couple minutes, but it's seamless to the crowd. So to me, that critical thinking and problem solving is anticipating and preparing for those things that could go wrong that would then impact the pleasure and the enjoyment that the crowd is going to get out of watching the performance. So those are two really, it's the best example I could think of collaboration and then critical thinking and planning.
I love that. And a lot of people go straight into a job. They don't think about the importance of the plan, the preparation, the night before, etc. And
Yeah.
yet that story, because it's huge risk if it doesn't, like if number one pilot is not looking at something and someone's following them behind, obviously there can be catastrophic events. So I love.
Well, and if I could, that's what happened with the Diamond crash up at Creech Air Force Base in 1981. So they were coming out of a loop, the four jets, and everyone was watching the boss, of course. and he had a malfunction in his jet, and they all four went into the ground, and all four passed.
Yep.
And again, of course, from that tragedy, right, a lot of changes were made and improvements, but I mean, so to your point, that's just the level of trust that you have, right?
I love that. All right. Oh, love your stories.
Thank you.
Anything else you'd like to share, including any helpful resources that our listeners might avail themselves of?
So I think, there's been a couple of good books that I've read lately. And you're going to have to forgive me. I don't recall some of the authors' names right offhand. But I know The One Thing by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan is a huge, huge resource and really helping you to discover that one thing on a daily basis that you can focus on that will move the needle forward in your life and your business. And for someone like me, it was a great resource because there's a lot of pictures in there, which means a lot of pictures means less words, right? Illustration. So that was a good read for me. Another thing is The 12-Week Year is an amazing, amazing book in terms of planning, right? Looking forward, but not so far forward that you overwhelm yourself with so many priorities, long-term goals, and tasks that you don't complete half of them, right? And of course, the two books I just recently started reading is Atomic Habits and then The Culture Code. So those four books, I think, are phenomenal, each in their own content in their own right. So I highly recommend them. And of course, there's this other great book called Erasing the Line in the Sand by this awesome guy named Dr. Mike Smith. And that book is really about societal acceptance, right? Approval addiction, the need for belonging, whatever you want to call it, how that equates to a cohesive team and people feeling like they belong versus not, which then impacts performance, culture, retention, and everything else. Just had to
I
throw
love
that in.
Of course. And of course, we will have a link with the podcast so that people can actually get a copy of your book too, because it's an awesome read and it's not too long either, which I really liked. So, Dr. Mike Smith, that was such an awesome interview. Anything else you want to add before we finish up?
No, I don't think. Just thank you so much for your time. And again, the tagline that I always like to say is meaningful change through intentional action. So as you go throughout your day as a leader, as a person, as an employee, as whatever stage of life you're in, be intentional about making meaningful change to impact the lives of those around you and yourself.
Love that. And my word for the year is intention. So
Love it.
perfectly aligned.
That is awesome. And we didn't even talk about that beforehand. So
I just thought it was the year for intention. So I was like, I
yeah,
really like that because it grounds us and it is way more deliberate than just sort of running around in a world that is a bit chaotic already. We don't want to
big
add to
time.
that chaos. Yeah.
Yes, 100%.
Can I say thank you so much for joining us on the Adapt with Danette FM podcast, Dr. Mike, and I'm sure I'll have you back on other editions. Want to send you a massive big hug because I can.
Thank you. Thank you. Right
And
back at you.
look forward to talking to you again soon. And thank you
Thank
all
you
to
so
all
much.
our listeners too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Danette, and hope everyone has a great week ahead.
Wow, what a great conversation. I feel like, what I liked about this one was that there's just so many good examples throughout the whole thing. Did you have any key takeaways, Danette?
I loved his Thunderbirds examples and particularly about everyone knowing their role, the level of trust. So when they're flying, the only person who's looking at the panel where it tells you what's going on is the lead pilot. The others are watching a point on the plane of the lead pilot and following that. So massive amount of trust. And I liked how the preparation before the air shows is incredible. So the pilot doesn't get in the plane on air show day and check all the instruments because they know that that's what their team does. So in terms of collaboration, one of the key takeaways I got that is that everyone knows their role and everyone trusts that people will do their role. So instead of looking and going, oh, has that person done that or has that person done that? And you're not really focused on your role. in this really high stake situation, everyone has that trust that the person who's supposed to do their particular thing has done it, and they check and recheck, and they have plan Bs and Cs in place in case machinery fails, etc., to make sure that the show goes on. So I really love that. And just even docs talk a bit about critical thinking and how when it's high stress, we often get emotional. And we really need to learn to become quite logical to make sure that we are solving the right problem, particularly under high stake pressure. So yeah, it was a great conversation, and I love the resources he shared at the end too.
Yes, yes. They will be all in the podcast description. I've got them all jotted down right here.
Nice.
The other thing that I wanted to highlight that I thought was really good was his thinking about leaders who think if you want something done right, just do it yourself, and how that creates a huge amount of lack of trust within the team. And I guess comparing those two examples of, him operating the sort of Thunderbirds unit, which is all about trust. It's basically built on a mesh of trust between engineers, pilots, and each other, versus a leader who is micromanaging and essentially through their actions saying, I do not trust you to do your job properly. And how much those two different things, like, he said how much he loved working on the Thunderbirds. And that is, I think, because of that trust factor. Everyone was so high performing and trusting of each other. It probably created a very valuable sort of bonding experience. So I just thought, because I've worked at jobs where there's been micromanaging and it's so hard to even be in the zone to do your job properly, and you feel that pressure. So I thought that was a really good example.
Yeah, I love that. And the wonderful thing about that, and we've talked to Doc on a Magical Learning podcast as well, is the process of debriefing after each exercise to be able to go, what worked, what do we need to improve on, etc. And the fact that that high trust allows everyone, doesn't matter what they're ranked, to be able to speak what they've observed in order to improve the process. So it's the importance of feedback and being able to go, this is not about me. This is about collaborating with a huge high-performing team. And so every perspective counts. And so being able to then debrief at the end and go what worked and what didn't is actually really good. It's not about blame. It's about learning. And I love that learning culture too, which obviously creates high trust too.
Yes,
Great
absolutely.
episode.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think it's also that sort of trust shows a level of respect also for the
Yes.
people, so, and if you feel respected at your work, at least that's something that you can take home and be like, okay, at least I'm feeling fulfilled.
Yes.
Well, let's jump. Speaking of people at work, I think we've got a question from Charlie here today.
Nice.
So let's see what Charlie has sent in. And to everybody, if you want to send in questions, you can send them through Spotify. We have a little section at the bottom of each episode. Feel free to send through questions. They are always very welcome. And this one's from Charlie. Okay. So Charlie says, I feel like I have the mental tools I need to solve problems, but certain things are preventing me from using them properly. I know for certain that I've got a good brain, but I fear that in some way or another my cognitive abilities are being clouded. Here are specific issues I encounter when trying to solve problems. Number 1, more often than not, I get overwhelmed when trying to solve a problem. I have all the information on my mind and a general idea of what to do with it, but my thought process always becomes a disorganized mess and I end up using my gut rather than my brain. Basically, my thought process falls in on me like a poorly constructed roof. A perfect example of this is when I try to plan a few turns ahead in chess. I know I want to create a setup in which I can reach a checkmate, but when I actually start planning, I get a sensory overload and my mind fills up with white noise, causing me to give up and play it by ear. Number 2, I often hit mental roadblocks that I just can't get past, once again leading me to say effort and use intuition rather than logic. And when I said effort there, I don't mean like take a lot of effort to do something. I'm bleeping the F word.
Yes.
And then finally, I have very little attention to detail, it seems. I always end up missing important little details that have something to do with the problems I'm solving. Any help would be helpful.
So let's start with the first bit about the brain getting a bit overloaded. And it's a bit like if you ever wake up in the middle of the night and your brain keeps playing the same issue and you just can't seem to solve it, nor can you go back to sleep. One of the reasons our brain does that is it's asking for us to give it attention and focus. It's a really simple tip, Charlie, that definitely works, and I've used it many, many times, is I always keep a notebook beside my bed. And I have a notebook with me pretty much anywhere I go. When my brain starts giving me information, I write it down. Now, the wonderful thing about that is watching or looking at something that's written down is way easier than trying to connect floating thoughts that are going around in your mind. So the first thing I'd say is absolutely make sure you write it down. That will help in many, many ways. The other thing is be mindful of what you're actually doing when you're writing it down. So in order to work best with our brain, it likes to monotask, not multitask. So monotask means it's focused on the one thing. So when you've got something that is complex, trying to do too many other things will just not work with your brain. So create a bit of space, maybe book a meeting with yourself and go through what you've written down and start to chunk it down, because often it's a bit like eating an elephant. We talk about if you eat an elephant, do it one bite at a time. So what you're trying to do is go, what have I thought about so far? Let's break those down a little bit so it's simpler to see what the process is. And using a framework around, say, problem solving or decision making, and there's a number of ones we talk about in the book and also on other editions of this podcast as well, that can help you in terms of problem solving and decision making. The second one about the intuition versus logic and quitting because you sort of go back to intuition is actually both are helpful in problem solving. So don't see one as good and one as bad. We're actually using more of our brain when we use both. Now, it is important when we use intuition to not be overly emotional, which is why bringing the logical side in can also help. And sometimes it's actually just helpful to discuss that with someone else, because they'll see blind spots that we have, particularly on the intuition side if we're a bit emotional around things. And the attention to detail, that's quite normal. There's a lot of people. So some people prefer big picture and some prefer lots of detail. So you sound like you're a bit more of a big picture person. Again, creating space to go, okay, what's the detail I need to make sure I'm across? Bringing in a partner who actually might be really good at the detailing and talking through, or, you might send them an email saying, this is what I've picked up. What am I missing? And so you're collaborating with another person or a team of people in order to be able to pick up the details. So don't think that it's a bad thing. Go to those where it's a strength of them and collaborate with them, because then we get the big picture so that we don't get so bogged down in the weeds. And also you get, okay, what is it we need to make sure we do to deliver on what we need to do? Again, any frameworks you can use, whether it's, you've got a checklist, a particular problem solving approach. The idea is you can do it, and doing it with others often helps us make it more rigorous.
Yeah, great example there, Danette. I mean, I think that it's certainly something that I've learned is that most of the organized people just are writing things down a little bit more than I am. That really is, at the end of the day, the human brain is not designed to hold a lot of ideas at once. And I think that I also forget that a lot, but I sympathize with Charlie on that one. Writing it down makes things a lot easier, and it makes you also more relaxed because you're less stressed out about forgetting it. So that's good. Well, Danette, did you have any final thoughts on today's conversation and just kind of that sort of level of trust, I guess, and anything that we've talked about or Doc has talked about?
Yep. And I just thought of something else for Charlie. If you're really feeling a bit foggy-headed, use your brain. So before you go to sleep, ask your brain, can you sort through this and make it a bit easier for me? And just keep a notepad next to your bed and write down what your brain gives you, because part of when our brain does the heavy lifting is when we're sleeping. So it'll actually solve often what your issue is because you're sleeping on it. So that's great. Now, for this episode, what a great episode. Loved it. Always love my discussions with Doc. And I love the theme of that high trust. So whether we are collaborating, whether we are problem solving, when we give others the benefit of the doubt, we set them up so that they know what they need to do, when they need to do it, and then we get out of their way. That's where we see great performance. And knowing that if something doesn't quite work, that we can have that conversation, and it's not about our egos, it's about making a better process. So I just love the lessons that Doc shared.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, and thanks for your insights as well, Danette. What a great episode. I
Yeah.
just wanted to again highlight before we head off that this is a companion podcast to The Adaptable Leader by Danette Fenton-Menzies. Go pick up your copy. It is a great read and you'll become more adaptable. The world's constantly changing. Why not be more adaptable? Yeah. So everybody, thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing. And as always, stay adaptable.